Hello and welcome to this review of the Caro Kann Defense chess opening. This video is geared mainly towards people just learning this opening and beginners. And so we will begin with the Caro Kann Defense, which starts out with e4, c6. This is the Caro Kann Defense. And in this opening, you see that white has taken control of the center and black brings out this pawn to c6 in order to push this d pawn forward, and then it will be fortified by the c6 pawn. So that's the main reason for this c6 pawn push. And play usually continues with d4, d5, fighting, both sides fighting for the center. And now this e-pawn is attacked. And here there are many different options for white. Usually the main line will go knight to c3, covering this pawn. And now pawn capture, knight captures. And once again we have some options here. The main move is generally bishop to f5, attacking the knight, and the knight will retreat and counterattack the bishop. And so the bishop retreats, and now we have h4, which generally you don't want to move these outside pawns, and especially in the opening. But here he threatens to trap this bishop, and so h6 by black leaves an escape route for this bishop. And so if the pawn pushes forward and the bishop retreats, then we have knight to f3, covering this d pawn, and development by black, and bishop to d3. And this bishop takes a nice central outpost, but it is captured. And here this exchange is probably to black's advantage, as this was a good bishop by white that was on the opposite color of his central pawns, whereas black's bishop would have been on the same squares as the central pawns, especially in this opening when black normally wants to push this pawn to e6. And so this helped out black in this exchange, and so white captures, and the game continues with more development. And finally that pawn pushes to e6 and castle by white. White generally castles queenside in this opening, as after this pawn push the kingside may be a little less secure. And the game may continue with bishop to e7, and now black can castle kingside. And in the Caro Kann, black usually castles, he has the option to castle queenside or kingside. If he's going to castle queenside, he usually brings this queen to c7 and then castles queenside. But because he held the queen back here longer in this variation, that usually signals that he's castling kingside. And now if we go back to the beginning, go over the first few moves: e4, c6, d4, d5. And in the first variation we played knight to c3 here, but white has other options, and one of those being the advanced variation by going here e5, gaining more space in the center. And now black responds with bishop to f5. Generally it's better to bring your knights out early in the opening, but here this bishop was brought out to f5 in order to prevent it from being blocked in behind its own pawns after an e6 move. And so white develops the knight, and now this e6 pawn push, and the the bishop is no longer blocked in. And if the knight were to move to h5 attacking this bishop, the bishop would probably, not be too, black would probably not be too worried about an exchange, as this is a bad bishop because of all these pawns being on the same color as his light squared bishop. It restricts the mobility quite a bit of that bishop. And play would continue with development on both sides. Now we have an attack on this central D pawn, and so white defends that. More pressure with this knight attacking, and now white castles. The king is safe. Exchange in the middle. More developing moves by black. And here white is already castled. Black will probably castle kingside as the c-file is open, so that would make it a little more dangerous on the queen side. But this was an example of how the advanced variation may play out. And if we go back to d5, instead of the knight to c3 move, or the advanced variation with pawn to e5, another option would be to exchange in the middle. And so the e-pawn captures the d-pawn and capture by black. And this exchange variation may continue with bishop to d3. And now this knight attacks the central pawn, threatens also to move forward attacking the bishop, and so c3 is played to take care of those threats. And now developing the knight, bishop to f4, and both sides develop. And here, one reason that this knight on the g pawn, the g knight was not developed earlier is to prevent a pin on the queen, and if the queen moves as it does in this position, to prevent the pawns from being doubled by a capture of this f knight, and also to wait to develop this knight to d2 and not block in the bishop. That's why this bishop was developed earlier in the game and why the knights haven't moved yet. And so queen moves, signaling a possible castle queen side. And now the knight moves to d2 to back up a knight move to f3. So knight to f3, an exchange. And now we have tension between the two bishops in the center here. And so white captures, getting rid of his bad bishop that occupies the same color central square as this pawn. And a capture, castle. Both sides are castled. So this is one other option, the exchange variation. And these are some of the moves that may play out. You have to try these different variations yourself, see which ones you prefer. And if we go back to the first few moves, e4, c6, d4, d5, and instead of the knight to c3 move, the advance or the exchange variation, a final variation I'll go over is the fantasy variation, in which this f pawn is moved forward to back up the center. And so a possibility is capture in the center, recapture, and e5 here. And this pawn move is possible because the f pawn is no longer protecting this line from the h4 square into the king. So if white captured here, there's a possibility of black moving queen to h4 with check, and then capturing the central e pawn here. And so instead of capturing in the center, white develops his knight covering this h4 square from a queen threat, and it is pinned to the queen. And so this pawn push helps cover this central pawn on d4, and both sides continue development. And here white is ready to castle, and only a few more moves by black, he'll be able to castle either queen to c7 and castle on the queen side, or take a little longer to castle king side. But that was an example of the fantasy variation, and so you may be interested in trying that out. But the fantasy variation is generally a little more crazy and risky, so if you're playing that with the white side, study up a little bit more on that, and probably for black as well, because you most likely won't see the fantasy variation as often as the main lines. And so if we go back to e4, c6, d4, d5, the knight to c3 move, which is used most often by white, and if there's a capture in the center, knight captures. And we went over bishop to f5 here, attacking this knight in the first variation we looked at. But there are other options for black, one being knight to d7, which helps if the other knight wants to advance out to this f6 square. Then this knight will back that knight up in case of a capture by the central knight of white. And so developing, and now he brings out this knight to f6 and doesn't have to worry about a capture by white. Capture, capture, and white is already prepared to castle kingside. Development by both sides, and pinning the knight to the queen. The bishop moved to take care of that pin, and so white castles queenside here, and black has a choice of castling kingside or queenside. So that is one possible way that variation, the Karpov variation of the Caro Kann defense, may play out. But if we go back and run through that again, and here, instead of this knight to d7 move, which backed up a knight to f6 move, if knight to f6 was played immediately, white has the option to capture this knight, which he generally does, and then black has to decide whether he wants to capture with the g-pawn or the e-pawn. If he captures with the g-pawn, his pawns will be broken here on the king side, but it is possible to do this because the bishop may then move in to this g7 square, and he can castle kingside and maybe even have play down the g-file on white's kingside. And so if after knight captures on f6, black decides he doesn't want to damage his pawn structure, he could recapture with the e-pawn, which may lead to development, queen check, and the queen blocks, and a capture early in the game. Queens are traded, leading to an endgame, which is why this king has captured the queen and not the king doesn't have to worry as much about being in the center after the queens are exchanged. And development by both sides. Now there's tension between these two bishops. And so white, instead of capturing, retreats, keeping his bishop pair. And now white didn't want to trade his good bishop, but he will trade this bad bishop, which is on the same square, color squares as his central pawn. And so here black could capture, white could recapture. And that is another possibility in this Tartakower variation of the Caro Kann. And so today we touched on a few different variations in the Caro Kann defense. So if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Also, please leave comments on what you thought, what you enjoyed, what could be better, or other variations that you would like to see. Thank you very much and have a great day.